So welcome to Life of Riley's November webinar, Collaborative Social Change and Justice, moving from single issue advocacy to consistent anti-oppression. This is actually our last webinar of 2023. And for those of you who've been attending our webinars this year, you know we've had kind of this really broad range of topics and speakers, both virtually and our webinars and our in-person events. We've had presenters who gave us tools like pethelpfinder.org that we could just immediately start using. And we've had others who gave us really concrete tips for engaging young people from our communities as interns or as employees in our animal shelters. And then we've had webinars that didn't so much leave us with a tool or a to-do list, but just left us with new thoughts and ideas and perspectives to grapple with. So I know that we've created with these webinars some discomfort over the past year. We kicked off the year with a webinar on anti-Blackness in the animal welfare movement, a topic that, creates some discomfort, if only because it introduces some new terms like white supremacist culture that might cause this immediate negative visceral response even before we can fully understand what it means. For those of you who joined us at our in-person event in Philly last month, Professor Justin Marceau challenged the ethics and the efficacy of using legislation, litigation, and prosecution to achieve our animal protection goals. And some people might have just outright disagreed with some of the things that he said. And that's okay, right? The point is not to agree with everything that's presented to us, but rather to stay open through all of the discomfort. So even for us at Life of Riley, when we invite a speaker to our events, our webinars, it's not necessarily because we endorse or even know about everything that person says or does, but rather because at some point they've said something or written something that has profoundly influenced the way that we view our work in animal advocacy. They have something to teach us, a perspective to share, a perspective that we need to understand. And at Life of Riley, we're trying to create a space to collectively practice overcoming that listening paralysis that's caused by hearing words that ping us or approaches that we disagree with, so we can really listen for the learnings. So today we're going to return to these difficult topics around identity and race. And I'm going to introduce a speaker who may seem slightly outside our sphere in companion animal protection. They are more in the vegan animal rights space, but what they have to share is relevant to our work in companion animal welfare as well. Our speaker today is Zane McNeil. Zane, pronouns he, they, is a scholar activist and editor of Vegan Entanglements, Dismantling Racial and Carceral Capitalism. Zane is also the editor of Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression. They are the co-manager of Rights for Animal Rights Activists, founder of Roots, DEI Consulting and Policy, and has curated courses on collaborative advocacy, labor rights within animal protection, and DEIJ for Sentient Media's Writing Collective. I first came across Zane when I read Queer and Trans Voices, Achieving Liberation Through Consistent Anti-Oppression. I think maybe it was almost 2 years ago now that I read that book. I thought the book was amazing. So I started following Zane on social media. And one of the first posts I came across involved some additional book recommendations. And I read all of those books too. And all of them have influenced the way that I think about my own animal advocacy efforts and our work at Life of Riley. And of course, whenever I meet someone who's been that influential over my work, I immediately want to introduce them to all of you and like the whole Life of Riley community. So Zane, I'll pass it over to you. And just a logistical note, we're planning to leave 15 minutes at the end for Q&A, so everyone's going to have a chance to interact and talk. And also just wanted to flag that this webinar is being recorded so we can share it with people who weren't able to attend today. So thank you, Zane. I'm going to pass it over to you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm going to go ahead and move over to my screen. I'm really excited about being in conversation with you all and thinking through these difficult and sort of complex topics. Hopefully, I'll make it in a pretty digestible surface level conversation, and then we can kind of dig in deeper at the end with questions, or you can reach out to me afterwards if there are specific things you would wish I'd covered or talked about. So I had come across this idea of consistent anti-oppression a few years ago. It was coined by Julia Feliz, who is a Black, Indigenous, non-binary vegan activist who is really empowered of thinking of these intersections between movements. And so this conversation we're going to be having is sort of, what are those intersections? Why do they matter to our work? And how we can think through consistent anti-oppression when we bring it into our campaigns and our strategies. So a little bit about me. I'm going to go ahead and make this smaller. I have been in this movement now for over a decade or so. I came into it thinking through feminism and animal exploitation. Was always an animal lover as a kid. And then through my introduction into vegan advocacy and animal advocacy, I started learning about how it was really a pinpoint for me for all of these other social justice movements I cared about. I cared about the environment. I cared about workers' rights. I cared about environmental racism. And I really saw animal advocacy as a way to address all these issues in one way, in one specific way. And so through that, I started getting into writing about these ideas with different thinkers, had curated a few collections. I'm also a freelance journalist. I've worked with Farm Sanctuary, the Humane League, ASPCA, ALDF, Sentient Media, HSUS, and a few others in different capacities. During 2020, I started getting involved with DEI consulting, especially for animal advocacy organizations, because of some of the issues we're going to be talking about today. I also started getting involved with RARA, which is a labor rights activist organization that is a kind of a supports all stop space for animal activists in the field. And I'm just really excited to talk about the way I perceive animal advocacy and why our single issue approach that some organizations and activists see as the go-to isn't always that helpful. It can actually be sometimes harmful and inhibit the work we want to do. So consistent anti-oppression is sort of a mouthful. As I mentioned, it was coined by this amazing activist who I co-edited Queer and Trans Voices with. They have an online website, which I'm going to share with resources with you all afterwards, that includes sort of a bill of consistent anti-oppression. So what the tenets are and what it really means. At a surface level, it's a framework that argues that all forms of oppression, from ableism to speciesism, sexism, racism, are all entangled with one another. And so from this perspective, animal advocacy can't really be achieved without building solidarity with other social justice movements. And so many advocates of color have done a lot of work on this. I've been saying it for a really long time. Affinsil Co., if you don't know their work, they're amazing. Arianish Birdie had founded Encompass. Julia Feliz, Lori Kim Alexander, Christopher Sebastian are just a few of these folks doing this work. And they're always very adamant that if we don't engage in consistent anti-oppression approach to our work, that actually reifies these oppressive structures. And I'm going to go into that a little more later because it's sort of difficult to understand at first, right? But actually, when we do a single issue approach, if we just do it with this idea of the animals without thinking through how animal oppression is connected to other social justice issues, and we can't disconnect them from each other. And so just the way that single issue veganism is automatically connected to these issues of racism and ableism, sexism, transphobia, homophobia, those are already getting into our work from a single issue approach. And it actually inhibits our work, our retention, our ability to do this. And so by bringing a consistent anti-oppression approach, we're able to do the work we want to do and achieve our missions in a much easier and authentic way. And so for me, why I think consistent anti-oppression matters is if we're really a movement committed to animal liberation, animal advocacy, justice, we have to make sure we're not complicit in creating internal and external hierarchies that harm marginalized communities, which happens sometimes in our work. And I'll go into that in a little bit. Also, just from a concrete material perspective on it, we're losing people. So we're losing bringing people in. We're losing the activists that are already here. We have a retention problem in animal advocacy because we're not committed to dismantling these internal hierarchies for our own activists and also thinking about communities as a whole that we could be bringing people into our work. And because we're reaching this limited audience and pushing people away, that means we're not able to achieve our missions. That means we have a limited focus and a limited impact. And I really want us to do the work we're doing in a way that is sustainable and effective. All right, so I want us to think through some of these questions as we're talking through this work. We could talk a little bit about it afterwards, but just something to frame your perspective on this conversation. Just thinking about what your place is in social movement spaces. Where are you coming to this from? What identity do you consider yourself having? For me, I'm trans, and that changes my perspective on animal advocacy because of that positionality. I'm Appalachian. I come from a low-income family. Those sort of things that makes us who we are. And how does that change the way you operate in the space? I also want us to think about how this enacts in our work, right? Do we have issues we face because of these identity markers? Have you noticed that in some of the work that you've done, that maybe there was unintended impact because we weren't considering how sometimes race or environmental issues or other disableism, different things have come into play that weren't anticipated? And, how did you become involved? Do you know people who left the movement who didn't want to join it? Sort of why consistent anti-oppression matters for you in particular. And so our roadmap is just a really short, quick surface level discussion on some of these challenges the animal advocacy movement faces, and then how a consistent anti-oppression approach can expand the reach of our work and bring more people into this movement. And then there's going to be some time at the end in a Q&A to think through these questions in a more concrete way. So the first topic I want to talk about is just ableism. So ableism is a word not everyone is familiar with, and it's just the discrimination and social prejudice against people with disabilities in favor of able-bodied people. And it's been found in vegans and animal advocacy spaces. It can manifest in language like voice for the voiceless. It can be seen as animal advocacy as plant-based, not making our spaces accessible for folks in a lot of different ways. And so some of the main thinkers of this are who you see here. Sunera Taylor, they wrote Beasts of Burden, Animal and Disability Liberation. Also one of my other favorite anti-ableist thinkers, their name is Guitry, and they founded the blog Crip Human Animal. And I think I also shared on the resources. In each of their blog posts, they think through these intersections. Why does disability politics matter to animal advocacy? In which ways is it a bridge between our animal advocacy work and disability rights? In which way are there stereotypes about our movement, right? That you can't do animal advocacy work, that you can't be vegan if you are someone with a disability? And then also thinking through why sometimes in our work we have ableist strategies when we should be considering how we can actually build stronger power together when bringing an anti-ableist approach into our work. So think through ableism and how, whether you're able-bodied, whether in different spaces you've been in, that they were ADA compliant, ways that disability matters to our movement. And then while we're talking through all these other issues, these are intersecting, they're not siloed. So just like animal advocacy is not a single issue because it's already entangled, disability rights, ableism, these systems that we're all trying to combat are intersecting. So disability rights matter in conversation and in entanglement with what we're going to be talking through for the rest of the presentation as well. And all of these build on each other. And so consistent anti-oppression contends that you can't fight for disability rights without bringing in speciesism. Similarly, you can't do single issue advocacy work in any way without thinking through these entanglements. So I think we've probably heard a lot about the animal advocacy's issue with feminism. I came into animal advocacy because I saw it as a way to bring my feminist perspective into my work in different ways. I was really inspired by authors like Greta Gard, Val Plumwood, Carol Adams, and thinking through why feminism matters for vegan politics, animal advocacy spaces. And I saw animal advocacy as a way to do feminism. But at the same time, our movement has had issues with feminism. You've seen that in some of the specific campaigns. PETA has had a lot of backlash for this. There's also in 2018 or so, there was Me Too AR, where different advocates themselves had faced sexual misconduct, harassment, assault in our spaces. And they went and you can see Coalition Against Nonprofit Harassment and Discrimination, CANHAD. They went and told their personal stories there about these issues. And so it's I want to just keep reiterating that these are all in conversation. So just like we have issues with this internally and externally in our strategies, it also is an entry point, right, for other activists. So for me, I came into animal rights because I saw it as a feminist space, right? But at the same time, we do have issues with it, right? And so when we're thinking through our strategies and are creating these nonprofits, these wonderful spaces for our activists, we have to make sure they're safe. We have to make sure that we think through how our strategies might be building into sexism, right? PETA, for example, has fallen into a lot of backlash for almost objectifying women in different ways. And so when we're bringing in this kind of objectification of different marginalized groups, that inhibits our work. And so when we're focusing on animal advocacy spaces, we also need to think through bringing in feminist perspectives on it, anti-ableist perspectives on it, anti-racist perspectives on it, both internally and externally in our work. And so for me personally, I've also seen a lot of intersections with LGBTQIA issues. And so for a lot of people, I was just in a conversation about this yesterday, they see animal advocacy as kind of coming out as an animal advocate, right? Or coming out as a vegan. And so, and there's also so many LGBTQ people in these movements because these intersections are personal to us. And so there's this intersection between LGBT people being otherized, right? By these systems of oppression, which is what Queer and Trans Voices is really about. And so to fight for animal advocacy issues, animals are also otherized in these systems. Queer and Trans Voices contends that you also have to work with a queer perspective on it, which is always a funny word for people who aren't in the LGBTQ community. And it's something personal for all of us. And so I'm going to go ahead and read just a really short passage from Queer and Trans Voices that sort of irons out this idea, which I think would also help with the rest of this conversation as well, because it talks through really what consistent anti-oppression means. Okay, so consistent anti-oppression, and this is particular to veganism, but matters to animal advocacy as well as queer politics. So while justifiably invested in breaking down a specific form of supremacy on the behalf of non-human victims, mainstream animal advocacy is primarily driven by a single lens viewed by the most privileged in a hierarchical society. So mainstream, that means white, cis, etc., has managed to flip the script within a species of supremacist hierarchy, right? That seems like a word jumble, but it goes into saying specifically that in essence, mainstream animal advocacy often prioritizes the violence perpetuated against non-human animals, rather above all other marginalized people, without recognizing how our species of society also harms the environment, slaughterhouse workers, low-income communities who live near factory farms, and how most of the privileged have historically harmed now vulnerable communities, including queer people, while proclaiming these same groups are now responsible ethically to undo the harm against one chosen group. So this idea of embracing a consistent anti-oppression perspective across all movements matters because all systems of oppression are inherently connected to each other. This is the same between the animal advocacy, non-human animal rights movement, to fight against speciesism, the idea that humans are superior to non-human animals. We must also fight against white supremacy, environmental climate change, capitalism, and so forth. And so this idea is that the same forces and structures that we fight against for animal liberation, animal advocacy work, also oppresses other people. It oppresses people who have disabilities, people who are marginalized because of gender, sexuality, and people who also face the disproportionate impact, as you all heard at your last talk, from carceral violence, right? Police and prosecutors. And so just like this is an entry point for people, as I mentioned before, we also do have an issue with this internally. Different nonprofits have had backlash. The ALDF had issues, were reported, alleged from different staff members. So just like these other organizations, our movements, organizations have been harmed by reifying these oppressions where that inhibits our work. The ALDF specifically had a large retention issue because of this internal culture. And also because it had this arm working with prosecutors, police, that also staffers felt were enacting harm onto others. And so when we're working with these structures that we feel like might help animals, it actually inhibits our work, both internally because we lose staff, but also externally because we push out and alienate people that might be interested in the work that we're doing. And so I really want to hone in on how this is enacted, how this is entangled with white supremacy and racism. So we're going to talk a little bit about anti-racism and why that matters, especially for advocates who are white. So in 2020, like I mentioned, that's when I started getting involved specifically in equity, inclusion, and justice work. That was after the murder of George Floyd by police, and many animal protection groups, including Animal Equality, 50 by 40, Mercy for Animals, farm sanctuaries released statements in support of Black Lives Matter. For many of these groups, these statements were some of the first time these groups had actually publicly come out in solidarity with Black-led social justice movements, but also publicly recognized how racism was embedded within their own organizations and committed to a deep self-reflection about equity work in the groups and the animal advocacy movement as a whole. While that was certainly an important step, and there are commitments that are being followed through in these organizations, and there's a ton more work that needs to be done, it just shows how this siloing has harmed groups previously, right? By 2020 being the first time a lot of these animal advocacy groups first came out, they weren't partnering with and investing in existing Black and non-white activist groups. They weren't centering anti-racist based justice in their programming. They weren't increasing Black and brown folks in leadership positions. They weren't educating themselves and their supporters and donors and the movement on how ending systemic racism tied into reforming the animal advocacy space and food systems and ultimately bringing an end to animal agriculture or rehoming animals. And so these were barriers in our movement beforehand, right? And there was in 2020 a commitment to accountability towards racial equality, both internally in our organizations and externally. And so when we're thinking through how to bring in consistent anti-oppression into the work you all are doing now, we need to think through that knee-jerk reaction as white people about, hey, I'm not a white supremacist, right? I got into this work because I care about animals and I understand. I'm not racist. I'm not, I care. And so thinking through how that's not exactly the focus here. We all have been indoctrinated into a system that has structural racism in it. And so that's why I have this here. Individual racism is different than interpersonal racism, which is different than institutional racism, which is different than structural racism. They're all entangled with each other, just like all of these systems are entangled with one another. But it doesn't mean that you are a bad person. And it doesn't mean these organizations that we're doing aren't well-meaning, right? That this work isn't good work, right? And so it just means that we need to have accountability to the harms we might have caused in the past and think through what anti-racism means at all levels of our organizations and our work. And so something that was really helpful for me personally was this workbook called Me and White Supremacy. And so it was written for white folks on anti-racism and thinking through how racism is entangled structurally, but also embedded in all of us. And so it was mostly written for white liberals. And you can see the quote here. I know it's long for a slide, certainly for a PowerPoint, but I think that being committed to anti-racism in all of our work is the first thing we need to do to think through consistent anti-oppression, because it's tied into all of the other parts we talked about. Anti-racism matters to anti-ableism, matters to anti-LGBTQ sentiment matters to animal advocacy. Because these issues have always been there. Animal advocacy organizations have done campaigns that have harmed specifically Black communities. And if we want to do the work we're doing, we have to recognize that racism is very alive in everything we do, especially when we're thinking through companion animals, right? Because race is connected to issues with wealth and poverty, right? It's connected to being homelessness and limitations to having property. It's connected to a disproportionate effect of the carceral system and punitive justice. And so when we're thinking through what consistent anti-oppression means to your specific work, I think it's important to continue educating yourself. Maybe consider doing a personal book like Me and White Supremacy, and then also consider how thinking through your organization's accountability to potential harm, right? And being really transparent with that. Just because there's harm that's been done, that doesn't mean the work you're doing isn't good. It just means that these are places that need to be accountable for, and that we can work on together as a movement to make sure we're not alienating folks, that we're not accidentally harming our communities that we want to work with, and that we're not limiting the work that we're doing for animals as well. And so, like I mentioned before, Encompass was an organization that was doing a lot of anti-racist work for the animal advocacy organizations. They no longer exist, but a lot of their resources are still there. And so as part of the resource list, I also provided the research that the Encompass has done. And what they recommended for predominantly white-run animal advocacy organizations was to, one, develop shared racial equity literature and vocabulary within your organization. Two, explicitly name racial equity a strategic imperative of your organization, really bring it up to the forefront and have that be embedded in all of your work, that anti-racist approach to all of your strategies and programming and hiring, everything internally and externally. So it's imperative for your organization to find their own voice, and with your leadership team, bringing in racial equity as a strategy. Identify an equity consulting partner and try to include this in your proposals for funders. Funders were really invested in thinking through equity concerns because from an effective retention point, it's a winner. Thinking through, you can't succeed for animal advocacy, and this is very research-based, without bringing in anti-racism and these other considerations of equity and justice into the work. It's necessary to fundraise specifically for this work and not just have it as a tag along. One of the things we saw during this DEI turn, as I say it, in 2020, is that organizations said they were committed, but then it ended up, because of limitations, saying, well, our money needs to go here instead of, and that way you can do that later. But as this presentation is trying to show, that you can't actually put money into animal advocacy single issue work without also recognizing how racism, ableism, homophobia, transphobia, etc., works in these spaces. And it's really imperative to focus on this right now. It's really to make sure that you're being as effective as possible for your mission. It's also really important to allocate time and bandwidth for your staff. One of the other issues we saw is that organizations were really quick to hire internal DEI staff, which was great, but then didn't provide them with the support, or asked mostly women of color and folks of color to do this work on top of everything else they were doing without reimbursement. And that led up to burnout, right? Because we talk a lot about burnout in our movement, but sometimes we don't consider how that's also entangled with these larger structures of these anti-labor work, and how burnout really is material in a lot of ways because of existing in these systems that aren't built for us as marginalized people. But it is still important to, if you have the funding, you fundraise for it, or are able to get the funding for this, to also hire a racial equity specialist and make sure they're supported to do this work and not set up for failure. And so, like I mentioned before, this isn't isolated. The movement as a whole, HSUS, Animal Charity Evaluators, MFA, they've really committed to doing this work and making actual accountability demands and saying, this is what we're going to do. This is the harm we've caused. These are the problems we're seeing. And this is why it's important to prioritize this. So we're certainly not alone in bringing in this consistent anti-oppression work into our space. It's something that the movement as a whole and funders have recognized is important and have moved towards. But I also want to just reiterate that consistent anti-oppression isn't DEI, and it's not DEI plus. Equity and justice matters, but it's really thinking through structural issues, right? So saying that there's structural oppression that's embedded in our systems, in our organizations that have these entangled oppressions in it. And so one of the examples of how that not recognize that has harmed the movement, this is one of my favorite articles. It's from Haley Huguet, who is actually writing in one of my new books on labor rights as well, but showing how the animal rights movement has hurt itself, and specific for the vegan movement, because there's a history of vilifying meatpacking workers. And I'll talk a little bit more about an example of collaborative advocacy for the work that y'all are doing with companion animals in a second. But one of the issues here, as an example, is that by vilifying workers, and you're not recognizing that the same oppression that is making them have the highest rates of PTSD in any employment, that lead to workplace injuries, that cause deportation, low income, poverty wages, are animal issues, right? Because these are the closest folks we can work with as allies. And so what Haley's work argues is that making workers allies rather than enemies is not about doing right automatically by human workers, so that certainly matters, but it's a winning strategy for non-human animals. And so this is a quote from Haley's work in my new book, but that traditionally the animal liberation movement has gone to great lengths to distance itself from other movements for social justice. It seems that the dominant strategy of the movement has been to advocate for non-human animals in ways that come at the expense of human ones in a lot of ways. So with concerns for racial justice and workers' rights largely off the table as entry points into mainstream animal rights movement, we are left with essentially three entry points: health, animal agriculture, and welfare. So why do we think that's a sufficient number of entry points for the movement, right? We're not bringing people in. And so this includes, like I mentioned, the internal work to dismantle the harm that occurs within an organization, but really also about building external partners, organizing across movements, and bringing consistent anti-oppression into the structures of your campaigns and programming. It's supporting the communities that you're working with, not working with police and prosecutors to help address these issues. And it's working to dismantle systems of oppression, not for animals, but people too. So focusing on what are the roots of this issue and what can we do about it. So I noticed a few folks from CARE here, and I'm really excited to have you here and talk with you a little bit afterwards. CARE is a companion animal organization that I am a huge fan of, that really focuses on the embedded roots of some of these issues, especially around companion animals. And so one of the programming, from what I understand it, the community animal care, it's really thinking about keeping animals together and bringing in the resources to community leaders and really raising the prominent leaders that are in the organizations. And so I think that they have a really important perspective on what companion animals advocacy really means when we're thinking through how we can keep pets at home, how we can make sure pets are fed, right? That's not a neglect issue or an abuse issue, that there's not cruelty. And a lot of that is bringing resources into these communities and building leaders where they are, making sure they have the resources. And I'm in law school right now. We talk a lot about movement lawyering. And so movement lawyering, the idea is not going into these communities and saying, this is what you need, or these are the problems that we're going to fix, especially through prosecution or criminal law, but saying, asking the communities what they need and then being there, raising them up. And that also helps because then there's not as much of a staffing issue, right? Because all of these strategies are expensive, right? For organizations, you need staff, you need money. And when you're going to the space, you might not be aware of the nuances and complications in these communities and really what their problems are. You might see it and then say, that's the issue. When you're working with community partners, you're not only making sure that the companion animals are able to get the best lives possible, that these people are able to get the resources they need. Because obviously a lot of you know that the issues around neglect is often a poverty issue, right? So bringing a lot of these folks need a safe space to be. I remember in 2018 when I was working with HSUS, there was a huge issue around domestic abuse federally and homeless shelters not allowing victims of domestic abuse to bring their animals in with them to shelters. And so there was a federal law that passed that was able to expand funding for this, right? But when animals are not able to be kept with their communities because of violence in the communities, because of poverty, because of homelessness, those are the roots we need to bring in. And a consistent anti-oppression approach allows us to see this. And so when we're thinking through a roadmap for transforming animal liberation from a single issue cause into a mass movement, we need to bring in a wide range of reasons for participation in the movement. We need to think through equity, justice, and inclusion issues. This means having more and better tactics in collaboration with other movements and letting marginalized communities lead with the support of organizations. And so on a personal individual capacity, going back to the questions we had at the beginning, and I'll go ahead and just go back there just so you can see them. Now thinking through these different identity markers, systems of oppression, the issues and harm organizations might have done, there's organizational differences that need to be made. And we really focus on structural, organizational, and movement issues. But from our individual capacity, we need to make our animal advocacy movement more equitable, independent of our roles in organizations, media platforms, institutions, wherever you're coming from. And so we need to continue to educate ourselves on these issues. Sentient Media has a anti-racist animal advocates group. They also have courses on DEI, labor rights, and collaborative advocacy that I helped draft with them that are completely free. Encompass has a list of recommended resources available for advocates who want to further educate themselves on issues of race, racism, and racial dynamics. I'm pretty sure CARE has a Ready, which is similar to a DEI course as well, which is I recommend joining. I also encourage advocates to advocate for themselves, right? When we're thinking about the animals, there's this idea of self-sacrifice, right? We care so much about this work that we don't want to inhibit the work we're doing or hurt these campaigns or the organizations we work for or hurt the animals. But really try to advocate for yourself when internally there are issues and act in solidarity with your colleagues, especially those from marginalized communities. That can look like white advocates lobbying nonprofit organizations they work for to take the recommended steps to improve equity in your organization, creating white accountability spaces at the organizations you volunteer for, and naming racism and anti-racism in the animal advocacy movement. And so there's spaces like Apex Advocacy's Caucus, and I know Akbar from Apex is here right now, but that's available also for Black folks from the global majority to build collective power. So white folks hold your organizations accountable and then create individual spaces, separate spaces for people of color to build power, to heal from trauma, and collectively advocate for one another. And then following in the vein of naming issues when you come across it, it's important to be there for transparency and open dialogue about problems that our movement has. When we're talking through sexism and Me Too, for example, in the animal advocacy space, we need to make sure we don't silence survivors and don't support perpetrators. That's a consistent anti-oppression issue, right? We need to trust and take care of the folks who come forward. There are platforms available. Like I mentioned, I work for RARA. It's a nonprofit it's a collective that really focuses on raising and supporting solidarity work within the animal advocacy space. Like I mentioned, CanHad has a space where you can be anonymous and share your stories. And it's important for advocates to be able to speak out both in the organizations, but also anonymously to make sure that people feel safe. Fourth, it's important going back to ableism to be conscious of the language you use throughout the day. It's something I continually work on, even though I think of myself as pretty good with equity issues because I've done this for a while. It's really a learning process. And each of us, because we're embedded in these systems, run into issues. So especially around ableism, sexism, and racism, you have to consider the way and be conscious about the way it informs the world, the way you see the world around you and the work that you do. And so a lot of people will use language that is limiting, like lame or crazy, without thinking through how that might be problematic or be supporting and reifying these systems of ableism, because we don't consider it, right? So it's important to think how language sustains discrimination and then interrogate it when you use it. If someone calls you out for different kinds of microaggressions, say thank you, right? And then recognize, even if people don't call you in or call you out, that doesn't mean that you aren't doing things that are harmful, right? Because all of us, by existing and being indoctrinated in these systems, create harm. It's just being accountable when that happens, and then thanking the people who bring it out to us, and then making sure we change our behaviors. And then fifth, if you're cisgender, really make a conscious effort to improve gender literacy. And, you know, a lot of people will ask transgender people or queer people to educate them on issues like, well, I didn't know this was a problem, or what does this mean? But there are a lot of resources out there about how to be a better ally to transgender and queer people, and to think through why pronouns matter, you know, why access and to gender neutral bathrooms matter, why sometimes trans people feel unsafe in workplaces, and then why it's important, especially around health insurance, to make sure that gender affirming healthcare is available for trans employees. And then I just want to say again, that anti-oppression is a way where it just is a theory to recognize the way our world is interconnected, right? And how, therefore, just like we don't live in a single issue world, we can't do a single issue movement. And so it's a way of speaking back to power. And so to work towards equity and justice, we have to consider how inequity and injustice is sustained by things like capitalism and white supremacy. They're big, scary words, right? That have a long history and a knee-jerk reaction. I get a knee-jerk reaction when I hear it too. But really going back to some of these questions and saying, it's not really about me, but what can I do about it, right? In our individually and organizations in a movement. And so these efforts are important because these issues are systemic, they're institutionalized in our work. And in a lot of ways, we don't always notice it because so many of our organizations, for example, are white, are cis, are male. And so that already is making our single issue work not single issue, because we're actually perpetuating these assumptions we have because of our positionality in the world and the work we do. And that helps when bringing these questions and considering it, but also bringing people from marginalized backgrounds into positions of power, right, and supporting them, because these are the absences we have when we're thinking through strategy, when we're thinking, we don't always consider the harm that might happen because our positionality might be from a different background than someone else's. And so bringing in folks who are from the global majority, folks who do have disabilities, right, folks who are queer and trans, and bringing them in and supporting them to do this work to help fill these absences. And so because at its core, consistent anti-oppression is a liberatory praxis, you also have to consider just how our animal advocacy movement also has to be really justice oriented, really has to be focused on liberation, not just for animals, but for all of us. And so that's my really quick go through of what consistent anti-oppression is. I felt like it was a speed run. I'm really excited to hear some of your thoughts, considerations, concerns, fears about doing this work, confusion, and just be an open dialogue with you. So thank you so much.